Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Vanessa Bohns. She is a professor of organizational behavior at Cornell University. Her research focuses broadly on social influence and the psychology of compliance and consent. And today we're going to focus on her book, You Have More Influence Than You Think: How We Underestimate Our Power of Persuasion and Why It Matters. So, Dr. Bohns, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, we're going to go or try to go through some of the main topics you explore in your book because you go through a lot of them, like compliments, expressing gratitude, being assertive, and all of that kind of thing. But before we get into some of them, generally speaking, how do you approach the things that you study here? I mean, how do you study the impact we have on other people?
Yeah, so I am an experimental social psychologist. So for the most part, I wind up running experiments to look at the impact we have on other people. But I do it a little differently from other people because I don't just look at the impact that we have, but I also look at our predictions and our expectations of
Yeah.
the impact, we're going to have or we have had. And so I usually run experiments where I have people sort of guess at how they will or how they have impacted another person. And then we ask the other person, or we get some sort of measure and we compare people's expectations to the reality.
Yes, so okay, let's start with compliments then, because sometimes I don't know if everyone has this idea or makes this assumption, but sometimes we tend to think that if we compliment someone, they don't really like that, they wouldn't take it lightly, or perhaps they think something bad about us. But according to what you've studied, is it that people tend to like compliments or not?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think when we receive compliments, for the most part, it's just all positive,
Yeah.
right? There's the rare situation where a compliment actually makes us feel sort of less valued and respected because in general, compliments convey respect and value and sort of belonging. I think you belong here because you look a certain way or you dress a certain way or you did something a certain way.
Yeah.
And for the most part, it just feels good when people say nice things about us.
Yeah.
Um, but when we think nice things, we often hesitate to say them because we worry that, maybe the way I say it will be really awkward and, the person will be annoyed to be stopped and bothered. Maybe this person has heard it a million times. They know that they're great at this. They know that jacket is terrific and they're not really going to appreciate this compliment. And so we kind of get in our own heads about this anticipated negative reaction that is just really, really unlikely because people just hear something nice and they feel really good. And so, as I said, when we test these things out, we ask people, what do you think the impact is going to be? And then we
Mhm.
ask the person who's been impacted, what was it? And when we ask people in our studies to give people compliments, just go up to strangers and give them compliments. They think they're going to annoy them. They think it's not going to, make them feel that good. And the people getting the compliments are just like, that was lovely. Yeah.
And do you have any idea why we tend to underestimate the positive impact we can have on others through complimenting them, for example?
Yeah, we tend to be a lot harder on ourselves than other people are on us. We kind of see every little flaw in how we say something or do something. So, we hear ourselves talk and we know that like we couldn't find the right word or we didn't express ourselves the way that we heard it in our head, for example. But nobody else is really paying attention to all that stuff. No one is sort of picking apart the things that we're saying and doing to the extent that we are. Um, and so one is that we're just extra hard on ourselves. And the other is that we're so focused on competence, like how articulately and how well and perfectly, we did something. Whereas other people actually care a lot more about warmth. They care a lot more about just, someone was nice to me. It doesn't matter exactly how that happened or exactly what they said, but they were nice to me and we had this nice connection. And so we tend to over prioritize or overemphasize the confidence angle when other people are really just seeing kind of like, a warm, kind person.
But does this only work for positive things that we might say, or does it also work for negative things? If we say something negative or careless, if we are irritated or angry and just say the first thing that comes to our minds, do we also underestimate how much negatively we can impact other people, or does it just also work for the positive stuff?
Yeah, this is a really important sort of caveat to what we were talking about is that it does also apply for negative comments
Mm.
and negative, information that we're spreading or giving to other people. And so it's kind of similar, right? If we say something negative, we have all our reasons in our head. We have this very nuanced sort of justification. We believe what we said usually. We know what precipitated it, but the other person just sees like this unpleasant, comment or has this unpleasant
Mhm.
experience. And we tend to underestimate sort of how unpleasant that feels to the other person. And what's interesting is this could be even in just like little throwaway remarks that don't seem that important. So, one of the things I talk about in the book is a story of my husband when he was a kid trick or treating here in the US. He went up to someone's house, dressed up in his Halloween costume and knocked on the door and said trick or treat. And the person opened the door and didn't recognize him as his like kid neighbor and just said like, I only give candy to kids. And made him feel really bad and kind of ruined his Halloween. And he went home and he never trick or treated again.
Oh
And
my God.
30 years later, right, he still tells us the story. Every Halloween, he tells a story about back when he was a kid and this person made this comment. So I'm sure that person has no idea that this little comment he made, would impact this person's life for 30 years. But it can, even these little sort of throwaway comments can.
What about gratitude? Are we good at expressing gratitude and do we do it enough?
Yeah, so gratitude and compliments share kind of similar properties in that we tend to worry that if we express gratitude to someone, so like a compliment could just be like a little thing, right? So
Yeah.
we worry about the embarrassment of like talking to a stranger or going up to someone when they're, doing something else. But with gratitude, it's usually a bigger thing. It's like we want to express gratitude to like a mentor or a family member who meant a lot to us. But we still have those competence concerns. We worry that, we can't adequately convey with words what they really mean to us, or that if we try to do it, it's going to be seen as weird or mushy, or, they're going to sort of unpack the way that we're doing it in this way where it isn't appreciated. But in fact, something very similar to compliments happens where people who receive expressions of gratitude, and they do this in studies where, they have people write letters of gratitude to people who they genuinely appreciate in their lives. And then they ask these people, like, how did it feel to get this letter? Right? We focus on like how well we express ourselves, but the other person is just like, wow, like I really meant something to that person. And it's not so much about exactly how they expressed it. And so, because of this sort of disconnect between how we think people will react and how they actually react, I'd say we don't express gratitude as much as we really should.
So, do you think that the way we think about our own impacts or our own impact on others might have a negative impact on our own psychology? Like, for example, if we think that people do not really see us, they do not care that much about what we say, for example, that we might feel ignored or invisible. Does that happen?
Yeah, and so there's actually research on something called the invisibility cloak illusion,
Mm.
which is this idea that we actually go through the world kind of feeling invisible, feeling like other people don't really notice us. And I think at the end of the day, it really makes us feel like, we don't matter as much as we actually do. Like our actions, our words, sometimes we just feel like, what's the point? I don't matter in the world. And, that can obviously have negative psychological effects. But in fact, people do notice you. They do kind of take cues from you about how they should behave and how they should think, more than we tend to realize. And so, um, I do think that there can be a negative psychological effect of not recognizing this sort of influence and this impact we all have.
But on the other hand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there also the spotlight effect where I don't know if this occurs to the general population, but at least a few people, when they are outside in a public space, particularly, they feel observed all the time and they think that every single person is looking at them and that some embarrassing or potentially embarrassing aspects of them, like the way they look, the way they dress, how they talk, and all of that kind of thing. So, is that effect real? And if so, I mean, if the invisibility cloak illusion is also real, so how do we square off one with the other then?
Yeah, so, and this comes up a lot if I talk about the invisibility cloak illusion,
Yeah.
because a lot of people immediately, that makes them feel insecure to think like, oh wait, now people are looking at me, like all those things I was
Yeah.
worried that they were seeing, like they're actually seeing and paying attention to.
Yeah.
And that, you're right. So that is also another sort of, it's actually not, a sort of an opposing finding. It's actually a complementary phenomenon that really occurs called the spotlight effect. And so the researcher who found the invisibility cloak illusion, her name is Erica Boothby,
Hmm.
and she wanted to reconcile these two effects. Like, when do
Okay.
you get a feeling of invisibility? When do you feel like you're actually in the spotlight? And she ran a study where she had people come into the lab and they either wore their ordinary clothes that they wear all the time, or she had them put on an embarrassing t-shirt that they felt really self-conscious about wearing. And then she had them interact with other people, and she had them guess how much other people were paying attention to what they were wearing. And she found that when they were just wearing their ordinary clothes, so like the sort of everyday experience most of us would have, they underestimated how much other people were paying attention to them. So they felt more invisible and they felt like their clothing was more invisible than it actually was. But when they wore this embarrassing t-shirt that they were like acutely self-conscious about, they actually overestimated how much people were paying attention to them. So that is the spotlight effect. So the basic idea is that when we're kind of going about our ordinary everyday lives and we have no reason to be like really self-conscious, we feel more invisible than we really are. But when we're really self-conscious about something like a bad hair day or an outfit that we're not sure about, or, stumbling as we cross the street, whatever it might be, then we think everyone's watching us, but that's not actually true.
So they are both real, but perhaps it depends on the context, right? If one
Exactly.
or the
Yeah,
other gets activated, let's say.
exactly. Yeah.
But what is it that people usually tend to pay attention to? Is it things that we are usually insecure about, or I mean, because if people pay sometimes more attention to ourselves and to what we're doing, then we tend to think what is it they're paying attention to, because that's what really worries many people sometimes, that they might be paying attention paying attention to the things that they are insecure about, but that might not be the case, right?
Yeah. So what these results kind of suggest is that people are paying attention to sort of other people as whole individuals, as sort of like blurry whole individuals. They're not necessarily, homing in on very specific features that we're super self-conscious about.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, many people have the experience of feeling like everybody's looking at, like everyone notices their new haircut, right? But really people, like half the people they encounter don't even realize they got a haircut, right? So it's people are kind of seeing you as a whole person. They're still seeing you there, right? But they're just not noticing that very specific thing. And so that's, I think it's a really positive sort of takeaway that you matter. People do notice you, but they're not sort of picking apart your features and your language and everything you do in the way that you kind of worry that they might be.
So, when it comes to the impact we have on other people or other people have on us, what happens when we share particular experiences with other people? Do we experience them differently?
Yeah, so there's some interesting work on experiencing something by yourself
Hmm.
and comparing it to experiencing it with other people.
Yeah.
So these could be things like, you're at a art museum and you're looking at art. That's one context they've done this in. It could be, eating dessert. So they've done other studies where two people have like eaten a piece of chocolate near each other. And you can imagine sort of in the real world, like going to a movie and sitting next to someone. So what studies have shown is that even when two people don't communicate at all, so they're not even talking about like what they like about a certain experience, or kind of conveying any even nonverbal behavior necessarily, like kind of making eye contact, simply sitting there or standing there with another person amplifies the experience, which means if it's a positive experience, it makes it more positive. If it's a negative experience, interestingly, it makes it more negative. And what's going on is that as you're doing something, when you're alone, you kind of just do it and you reflect on how you feel about it. But if someone else is there next to you, you're simultaneously thinking about how they're experiencing it at the same time as you're thinking about how you're experiencing it. So it amplifies that experience because you're kind of doing it through two minds.
So it's basically an effect of or the result of empathy, right? We are empathizing
Yeah.
with the other person and thinking that they're experiencing more or less the same thing that we are, and so it sort of amplifies what we are experiencing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the researchers call it mentalization. You're like kind of imagining someone else's mental state, but
Yeah.
I think empathy is also another way to talk about it.
Great. So tell us now about this phenomenon of audience tuning. So, what is it, and is it that when people adapt their speech to specific audiences, I mean, what are they adapting exactly? Is it just their tone, the way they speak, or even also the content itself of what they're saying?
Yeah, this is a really interesting phenomenon that when we're talking to other people, and it could be, one other person that we're having a discussion with, or it can be that, we're standing in front of a whole audience. But anytime we're sort of speaking to other people, we care a lot about connecting with that person and, developing a relationship. We care about that person liking us. And even if all that is kind of happening under the surface unconsciously, it plays into how we talk about things. And so we tune our messages and the actual content of our messages to our audience. So if I think that, you're going to have a certain opinion on something, and I share that opinion, I'll like really lean into that opinion. I'll make it even stronger. If I think that, you won't share that opinion, I'll kind of tone down my opinion. So, for example, if I went to dinner at your favorite restaurant last night and I had a really bad experience, I'm not going to talk about how awful that restaurant is because I know you really like it, right? So I'll tune my message, I'll make it a little softer. I'll say, yeah, it wasn't the best night for that restaurant. I think I didn't love this or that. So that in that way, I'm sort of adjusting what I say to suit the audience.
So that's interesting. So I don't think you do work specifically on this, but with that in mind, do you think that sometimes perhaps we might have an exaggerated view of things like, for example, political polarization? Because people on the internet or elsewhere might be doing a little bit of audience tuning, and perhaps it's not that they are so extreme in their views, but just because they tend to interact with particular people or they move in particular social contexts, they basically tune their messages or what they say to those specific audiences. I don't know if you think these would apply here in this particular context or not.
Yeah, I do because, if you go in and you're basically telling, it's in a way, it's sort of like pandering,
Yeah,
right? You're pandering to your audience, you're telling them what they want to hear.
yeah.
And if they hear what they want to hear, there's nothing there to sort of challenge them or to kind of dial it back a little bit. Um, so I do think so. I do think that that can sort of exacerbate this sense of political polarization that, like, yeah, look at all these people who agree with me, right?
No. And what about the saying is believing effect? What is that about?
Yeah, so this is also really fascinating because if you are changing your message when you're speaking to an audience, right? You
Yeah.
could say it doesn't really matter. Like maybe it matters to the audience, but the speaker knows that they're doing it. They know that they're pandering. They don't really believe what they're saying, right? And after you do that, you can go right back to believing what you thought initially. But in fact, the saying is believing effect suggests that if you say something and then you see that the people you're saying it to like are really they agree with it, they're nodding along, you've developed this connection, it kind of reinforces that message that you just said and you start to believe it a little more, right? So you said it, now you believe it a little bit more. And what that means is that simply by speaking to an audience and tuning your message to that audience, it can actually change what you believe, right? So it's not just you sort of impacting the audience and being the person who's persuading the audience, it's you almost persuading yourself through what you think the audience believes. And that's in a way the audience kind of persuading you at the same time. It's a really interesting sort of example of how influence really is a two-way street. It's not just in one direction.
But in this case, it's a social effect, right? I mean, we say something, we pay attention to other people's reaction, and if they react in a way that we consider positive or reinforcing, then we are more prone to really start believing actually what we're saying, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And you can imagine sort of the opposite, right? I say something and then the audience is like booing or like
Yeah.
really tuning out. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe that wasn't, maybe there's something wrong with what I said, and I changed my tack a little bit potentially.
So let's talk now a little bit about behavioral contagion. So, how does this occur, and what power can one single person have by him or herself? Because, I mean, how far can behavioral contagion go?
Yeah. So behavioral contagion is basically the way that behaviors can spread through a network of people in the same way that you think of like a disease spreading.
Yeah.
And it's not the exact same way. I mean, a disease, you can have like one contact with a stranger and potentially catch something. So this is usually if they're like high stakes behaviors, it's more like your neighbor's doing something or
Yeah.
people you see repeatedly. Um, but one of my colleagues here at Cornell, Bob Frank, does some interesting work looking at how behavioral contagion can impact things like smoking rates. He's looked at how it can impact solar panels. So he talks about sort of looking at this aerial footage of neighborhoods where you see these clusters of solar panels that almost look like a disease spreading, right? Like it's just like one spreading to the next. And he explains it through behavioral contagion. So, you imagine like walking around your neighborhood and you see someone starting to put up a solar panel and you naturally sort of wonder about other people. You're curious about other people. And so you start to sort of simulate, you ask questions like, why are they doing that? And you sort of answer them, I bet they're doing it for this reason. And you're essentially simulating that decision making process for yourself. And so then you're like halfway there to thinking about it, and that can make you more likely to do it. So it's really interesting to me that there's this evidence that it has this impact even in things like putting up a solar panel, which is a pretty big behavior. It's an
Mhm.
investment of time and energy and money. So.
But do we have any idea how far it can go? I mean, the impact that like one single person can have just by changing one behavior that perhaps a few other people really pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on a lot of things. Who is that person? Is it someone? So the closer you are to that person, the higher status they have, all those their
Hmm.
centrality in a network, for
Right.
example, all those things can matter. The frequency of the behavior, the sort of how big the behavior is, if it's like risky versus not. But it does seem that, there certainly are a lot of behaviors that you see someone do and you just repeat. And you could like the times it's the most effective is when there's some ambiguity and it's kind of a low cost behavior. So, for example, there's work on like littering. So if you see someone litter or put their trash in a trash can, that's a pretty low cost thing to like walk to a trash can and put away your trash. And if you're not sure where the trash should go, you're looking to other people. And in cases like that kind of behavior has a big impact on the people who see it.
So, and when it comes to talking the first time to someone we've never met before, of course, many times we are really anxious about it. Also, I guess, depending on who it is we're talking about, and we think we usually tend to perform badly and that we leave negative first impressions and all of that. But is that true? I mean, usually when we talk when we have a first talk with someone new, what kind of impressions do we tend to leave on the person?
Yeah, so this is another finding in the book that's just, I think, really reassuring, which is something called the liking gap. And that's this idea that we think that we leave a more negative impression than we actually do when we interact with other people for the first time. So when researchers have had people interact and then they ask them after the interaction, how much did you like that person and how much do you think they liked you? We tend to say like that, yeah, they were really nice. I liked them. I had a nice interaction. I talked to them again, but I'm not sure if they liked me. I'm not sure if they had a good interaction. So we tend to be, again, in this other context, harder on ourselves than other people are on us. And so you get these gaps in how much we like the other person and how much we think that they liked us. But if you actually look at their ratings, like they liked us just as much.
Well, that's reassuring, I guess. And do you think we should be so worried about saying the wrong thing or things? I mean, because nowadays we hear a lot, and we'll get to this back to this topic later on in the interview, but uh, from some, I don't know, coaches or influencers on the internet that we really have all the time to say the correct thing the first time or will really make a bad impression on other people. But what does the research really say?
Yeah, so this is kind of similar to what we were talking about with the spotlight effect and the
Hmm.
invisibility cloak illusion, right? That in a lot of ways, people just aren't paying attention to, on sort of one level, like the specifics of how we look compared to us just as a whole
Hmm.
person.
Yeah.
But this is similar also for the things that we say, right? So people tend not to sort of pick apart each time we like stumble or say a wrong word because people are actually nice. Like they want to
Yeah.
connect with other people, particularly in person, right? So a lot of this is in-person interactions. And so there's something called fuzzy trace theory, which is this idea that after we speak, or after someone reads something or gets any kind of sort of language, we're not very good at remembering the exact words of what someone said. We just get the gist of what they said. And so that leaves sort of a fuzzy trace of what somebody said. So we're less likely to sort of jump on them for the specifics because we don't really even remember the specifics, right? We're like, okay, this person liked that thing. They made a case for it. I don't remember all the details, but like it felt like a strong case. And so this idea that, if I don't say something perfectly, people are going to jump all over me or they're going to notice that is just usually not true.
And when it comes to influencing or persuading someone, how assertive do we really need to be? Because that's something that we also hear a lot, that to really be convincing, you have to be assertive and as assertive as you can be. And if you can be more assertive, it's even better. But how does it work exactly?
Yeah, so there's some research that suggests that we actually overestimate how assertive we should be. That,
Yeah,
in fact, we think that people are going to listen to us more if we like
yeah,
really kind of raise our voices and say things like really authoritatively.
yeah.
Um, but in fact, people are much more sort of open to things than we give them credit for and are more open to softer appeals, things that don't immediately put them off or challenge them or make them like want to immediately argue back. Um, One distinction I like to make is between being like aggressive and being direct. So it's good to be direct. I think too often we beat around the bush because we don't want to just say something directly to another person.
Right.
But that's not the same as being like aggressive, right? Or even necessarily assertive. So being able to sort of say the truth, say what you're really asking for, say what you really think, right? But without necessarily, making it super assertive is kind of, I think, this sort of sweet spot for getting people to listen to us.
So, we've been talking a little bit about some insecurities that people tend to have when thinking about the impact they have on others, or sometimes thinking that they're being overlooked or ignored. But there's also at the same time the phenomenon of overconfidence, where there are particular areas, not all areas or all domains, but there are particular domains where people tend to rate themselves above average. But there's also particular domains of life where people rate themselves below average. So could you tell us about this? I mean, what are the specific domains where people tend to think that they are below average specifically?
Yeah, and it's a good point because there's a long history in psychology of this phenomenon of overconfidence, right? And so it's definitely a real phenomenon where we think, it can lead us to take more risks than we really should because we think that we're going to be luckier,
Yeah.
than we actually are, and we think we're better drivers than we actually are. And what's interesting is that a lot of the research that has started to show this underconfidence has been in the social domain. And so overconfidence seems to be more about when you're sort of comparing yourself to your previous behavior and you sort of look back on the times that you drove really well and that's what you remember and you think that you're a really great driver. But with social contexts, we actually tend to be more insecure and sort of pay more attention to the times we like embarrassed ourselves, right? Or made a fool of ourselves. And we also tend to compare ourselves to other people when it comes to a social context. So we look outwards at like really social people, people who have lots of followers on social media, people who go to all the parties, and we compare ourselves to them. And so we never quite sort of stack up to the most social people. And so it does seem to be that it's in these interpersonal contexts that we see this underconfidence, as opposed to overconfidence in these more like, how smart we are, our vocabulary, things like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The fact that you mentioned social media and the number of followers people have, and when sometimes we go on social media and see some particular people that apparently are partying all the time or going out at night all the time with and have tons of friends, but because there are instances where people then, for example, go on online forums and they say that they don't have any friends at all. They feel
Hmm.
isolated and lonely, or even sometimes make YouTube videos, and then suddenly there's a ton of people going there and say that they have exactly the same experience. So sometimes we just have an inaccurate view of what the average person or the average life is, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the things that we see when we kind of scroll through social media, right, are people who are out doing stuff.
Yeah.
But what we don't see is like all the people and sort of, on our block who are at home just on their couch, just like us scrolling through Instagram, right? Because people aren't posting about those things. And so that leads us to have this sort of inaccurate view of what's average for being social.
Yeah. So talking about requests now, when people approach other people asking for something because they want to request something, I mean, many times we think that people will just say no, like 90%, 99% of the time, or even 100% of the time, and we will make ourselves, we will look like a fool or look silly because we're bothering other people with our asking for help or something like that. But how do people tend to react to requests, actually?
Yeah, so this is another area that's the research is really reassuring. So, as you said, when we ask people for things, we tend to be very hesitant. We think
Yeah.
that we're going to look bad by asking for
Mm.
things.
Yeah.
But there's research that shows, for example, if you ask someone for advice, that they actually see you in a more positive light because they're like, oh yeah, you came to me and I'm happy that you came to me. And so you must be really smart to come to me for advice. It kind of strokes people's ego in a way.
Yeah.
Um, and also we tend to think that people are more likely to say no to us than they actually are. So, we think like, oh, if I go and ask this person for a favor, I ask them for help, there's like a good chance they're going to say no to me.
Mhm.
But it's actually really hard for people to say no. And if you think of the situation from the other side, right? If you had a friend or a neighbor or a colleague who came up to you and asked you for something, it's really hard to say no, right? You have to come up with the words to do so. You don't want to hurt their feelings. You don't want to seem like a jerk. And so, in fact, people are much more inclined to help us, in part because it's hard to say no, but also because they actually tend to be kinder than we think and less judgmental than we think. And so, this idea of asking for things as being so fraught, really, it doesn't need to be as sort of painful as we make it out to be.
But I mean, in the kinds of studies that you and other people have done, what requests or kinds of requests are we talking about here? Because certainly there are limits to what other people are willing to say yes to, right?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of studies on this at this point. So I've been studying this main sort of research focus of asking for things for 15 years, and we've had
Yeah.
participants in my studies ask like over 15,000 people the last time we calculated for things. And there are a wide range of kind of small favors. So there are things like, will you fill out a survey for me? Will you donate to charity? Will you walk me over to this place I can't get into or I can't find? Will you loan me your cell phone so that I can make a phone call? And in all those cases, people overestimate the likelihood of rejection by about twice as much. So I think people
Mhm.
are twice as likely to reject them than they actually are when we actually send our participants out to ask these requests. Um, and it's interesting because I agree that there are limits, but I think that the limits are not they're they're higher than we think that they are. So we've done things like we'll vary the size of the request. So we'll have people ask for like a big request, like fill out this packet of surveys, as opposed to like this just one pager that'll take a second, right? And the askers feel like that's going to make a big difference. But actually, when they go out and make this request, it doesn't make a big difference in the people who are actually, saying yes. And so I think that we kind of base our impressions of whether people will do things on like, well, how big is this request? And they aren't making such a cost benefit calculation. Like a lot of it is more emotionally driven like, oh yeah, I want to help this person out. I'd feel bad if I did it.
But when it comes to saying no to requests, do you know if it's easier, for example, for people to do that when it's through email or other written mediums instead of having really the person in front of them.
Yeah, so all those findings where I said, it's twice as likely that they'll agree than we think, those are all face to face.
Okay.
So that's an actual face to face interactions.
Yeah.
Um, we have done studies where we've done it over email, and
Hmm.
we get the opposite effect. In fact, we find that people are 34 times more likely in one of our studies to agree face to face than over email.
Hmm.
But our participants don't realize that. They kind of think that, again, people are going to make this cost benefit calculation. They're going to be like, is this worth my time? Do I want to do this thing? As opposed to, I'm standing face to face with someone. This is a much more emotional situation. I can't say no, or I feel bad and I want to help. And that is actually how more decisions about whether to help are made.
But I mean, even over email, for example, is it that even then people tend to say yes more frequently than people would imagine or not?
So it's actually the opposite over email. So they say yes less often
Okay.
than we think.
Okay.
So it winds up being, yeah, the total reverse
Hmm.
of the effect, which is really interesting.
But I mean, this might be a complicated question, but why do we have any idea why people say yes? I mean, is it that they genuinely want to say yes, or are they just trying to avoid the negative feelings that come with saying no?
Yeah, this is a really good question that actually myself and some other researchers have been trying to unpack.
Yeah.
I would say that both things are likely happening. So I think people are more generous and willing to help and just generally helpful than we give them credit for. So
Hmm.
there's a phenomenon called the myth of self-interest, where we think that other people do things out of self-interest, they don't do things to help other people. And that's just not true, right? So people actually do have pro-social motives to be helpful. Um, but at the same time, we all know that it's also hard to say no. And sometimes we
Yeah.
really genuinely don't want to do something, but it just is too hard to say no. Um, the nice thing is that often if we do something and we're helping someone out and it's something that we feel like is a good thing to do, even if we don't feel like doing it, we wind up feeling good in the end. So it's okay. The problem is in situations where we really don't want to do something and we feel uncomfortable with it. So
Hmm.
we have studies where we have our participants ask people unethical things. They ask people to do things like vandalize library books. And we find similar effects where people are twice as likely to agree as we think. And in those cases, obviously, like they're not doing it to be helpful. They really feel pressured. And that's where it's a little bit more problematic, right?
So that bit about asking people to do unethical things is really interesting because I would like to ask you if you have any particular thoughts on a specific subject. So in recent years, for example, we've been talking about a lot about the MeToo movement and stuff related to that. So, do you think that with that in mind, there might be specific contexts or situations where people who end up being, in this case, unfortunately, sexually abused, might comply to that just because they don't want to say no to a particular person in a particular context?
Yeah, so that's also something that I've looked at in my research
Yeah.
is the extent to which, people will actually agree to romantic requests and advances,
Mhm.
um, because it's so hard to say no, as opposed to the idea that they actually want to do that.
Mhm.
And so there's some other researchers who have shown that people will actually agree to, go on dates with people they don't really want to go on because it's too hard. They kind of they don't want to be jerks, right? It's not just it's a discomfort, but it's also like I want to be a nice person,
Mhm.
right? And then in our research, we've shown that not only does that happen, but also the person asking doesn't realize that that's happening, right? They assume like, oh, if this person is agreeing to go along with whatever this might be, this, this date or this sexual advance or whatever it is, that
Yeah.
they must be doing it willingly. And they tend to overestimate how willing that actually is, which, can create these problematic dynamics. So we do find this bias across the board where people who are interested in someone else,
Yeah.
and if it's reciprocated, they think it's more voluntary than it is in many cases.
So this is really a complex subject, right? It's not really just a matter of people assuming that if someone sort of complied, it was really because they were really willing to do that, and later on, if they come and say that no, they really didn't want, and they felt pressured or something like that, and now they want to sue the other person or something like that, then I mean sometimes that is really genuine. People are not lying. They didn't say no, but it wasn't because they didn't want to. It's just because they felt pressured to not do so, right?
Yeah, yeah. And this is so a lot of my most recent research is on this distinction between compliance, which is just like the behavior of going along with something, and consent, which is where you're actually doing it voluntarily. You don't feel pressured into doing it. And so, yeah, consent, we can see compliance because it's a behavior. We see people do something, but we can't see going on in people's heads, right? And exactly why they're doing it. And so we have to trust sort of um, what they say their motivations are, and whether they truly felt like they consented to something.
So, and this influence that we have on other people, of course, also manifests in contexts where there's a power differential. And so, do you think that perhaps, as in that case of someone complying to have sexual intercourse with another person and then not really wanting to do it, but the other person assuming that they are willing to do it and never questioning it, do you think that people in positions of power, of course, not just in the case of sexual abuse, but abuse more generally speaking, might overlook how much negative impact they might be having on on the lives of people that are below them in the hierarchy, just because they look at them complying and they don't really think or consider the possibility that they're not really happy with their situation, for example.
Yeah, and so it's really interesting because you would think people in positions of power would be sort of acutely aware of the power that they have and the
Yeah.
influence they have. But a lot of that awareness comes from being able to get into other people's heads to really know like how you're coming across to somebody else in their
Yeah.
mind. And people in positions of power, it turns out, are really bad at taking other people's perspectives. They're less likely to do it. And when they do it more ineffectively. And so, yeah, it actually makes you worse at sort of understanding how you're impacting other people. One of my colleagues uses this phrase that I find really useful, which is when you're in a position of power, your whisper sounds like a shout to people who don't have power. But you don't really realize that, right? Like the little suggestions you make, if you ask somebody to do something that they don't want to do, whether it's, in a sexual context, like asking someone on a date, or if it's, another context, asking someone to do something unethical, or even just to take on more work than they're comfortable with, you may feel like, oh, they'll just say no if they don't want to do it, but they don't actually feel like they have the freedom to say no to you. And you are really bad in a position of power at sort of recognizing that.
Also, because perhaps people do not consider the fact that many times people who are low in the hierarchy can't really afford to say no or push back, for example, against their bosses because they might risk losing their job and then their life gets even worse, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's also, there are these sort of psychological effects, but then there are these structural effects where it's just like, you know, to the two people just have different consequences, right? The
Hmm.
person in the powerful position and the person who's not in the power position. And another interesting thing about that is that people in lower power positions often will, smile more and be like nice and show these kinds of like very sort of kind and praising behaviors towards people in
Yeah.
positions of power. It's just sort of a natural thing to do, and they can appear as like actually being interested, for example, romantically or in other ways, right? To the person who's in power, they see it as more genuine rather than as just sort of a natural way that you interact with people who have power over you in a more deferential kind of way.
So, talking about the job context, in the book, you also at a certain point mention perhaps a few questions that you think should not be asked in job interviews because they might influence the employer's decision and change their impression of particular candidates. So, could you tell us about that and what are give us some examples of the questions that you think should not be asked?
Yeah, so there's been interesting work on the way that sort of search committees who are hiring will use information like gender, and in particular, whether someone's married, whether someone's pregnant, whether they're thinking about becoming a mother. So a lot of questions around that.
Yeah.
And in terms of, whether that means they would actually come to a job if they were offered it, or if they would leave in a couple of years. And there's work in sociology, where they've um, kind of laid out actual discussions among search committees about these sorts of topics, right? Which are not reasons to hire someone.
Yeah.
Um, and so one of the ways to avoid having that information be used in a hiring decision is to not know it in advance, right? To just not know if someone's married or if they're pregnant or if they have kids or whatever it might be. But I'm sure anyone who has sat down with a job candidate or just tried to make small talk with someone, right? Family information comes up. And if you're not trained in how to do an interview, for example, it can easily, it could be a question that you ask, like, oh, do you have kids? And all of a sudden now you have this information that could play out in a decision. And one interesting thing is that people will often ask the question because it's part of small talk, but qualify it with, oh, you don't have to answer that, right? Just, to be HR compliant, to be legally compliant, whatever it is, you don't have to answer that. But a job candidate doesn't really feel like that, right? They don't feel like they can say, like, okay, I'm not going to answer that. They feel like they have to respond. And then now you have this information you can't sort of unsee that could impact your decision.
Right, and in this particular case, we probably shouldn't sort of blame the victim, right? I mean, if someone is being interviewed for a job and they are asked something, even if the person doesn't feel comfortable answering the question, perhaps they feel pressured to do so and they might reveal some information that then influences the decision negatively, but it's not really their own fault, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really, on the person in that case who is in a power position, the interviewer, to sort of pay attention to the things that they're asking and recognize that dynamic where the other person's not going to feel comfortable sort of saying no.
So, do you think that the fact that we tend to underestimate how much influence we have on other people might also have manifested in particular ways during the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of perhaps not caring too much about following certain rules that were in place to protect other people and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it was interesting to see the reactions to COVID, especially early on, when things were bad and there were just
Yeah.
so many sort of pleas for people to stay home. And you would see this video footage and this news footage of just people who were still going out to bars and, going to parties and whatnot. And I do think that a lot of that was, not people necessarily being selfish and being like, I don't care if I, hurt other people by my behaviors. Um, I think it was people not recognizing how they could hurt other people. This kind of
Yeah.
egocentric bias where they, are only seeing their own situation and are not recognizing how, like, oh, they could wind up, spreading germs to other people. They're more worried
Mhm.
about like the germs that might come to them. And so, yeah, I think it definitely played out in those ways. I think it also played out in positive ways, in all the ways that people really helped one another. You would put up a request or something, and lots of people would try to help you, in sometimes surprising ways. So.
So, are there specific ways that are backed by science that through which you think we could become more aware and mindful of how much influence and impact we have on other people?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about three things to start doing, right, to get better at seeing, feeling, and experiencing your influence over other people. So the first one is seeing your influence, and so that is this idea that one of the reasons we don't see the influence we have in other people is just because biologically we're always looking out through our own two eyes, and so we see all the ways that other people impact us and all the ways that they impact one another, but we don't see ourselves in those scenes. And so doing sort of these exercises or these visualizations where you get out of your own head and you picture scenes from a third party perspective can help you see how you contribute to certain dynamics, right? So like imagine that meeting that was kind of uncomfortable, but imagine it from a third party neutral perspective. Like, what are the things you were saying in that meeting? The second one is getting better at really feeling your influence over other people. So, you can know that you're saying things that people are responding to, but not really understand how those things make that person feel or those people feel. And so I recommend asking more questions, essentially. So there's a distinction between taking someone's perspective, like where you really try to understand what they're thinking, but you never actually ask them, right? So you're often wrong. Or just asking them, like, how did you feel about that thing? And that's actually getting their perspective, like seeking it out. And that makes you much more accurate at understanding how you impacted someone. And then the last one is experiencing your influence. And that's just like testing it out in little ways, asking for favors, instead of holding back because you think someone's going to say no, giving compliments, expressing gratitude, like we talked about earlier. But just seeing, like, oh, yeah, it does, like, I do have this influence if I just try it out a little bit each day.
Right. So I have just one last question then, and I've been alluding to this more or less throughout the entire interview. But by reading your book, I mean, one thing that I really noticed is that some of the findings there, at least to some extent, run counter to some of the things we hear, particularly on the internet, coming from influencers and gurus and people who try to tell other people how they should present themselves, how they should talk in public situations, and all of that. And I mean, we hear frequently how we should really be assertive and how we should train ourselves to say the right thing the first time, every time, in all situations. Otherwise, people won't take us seriously at all. That we should present ourselves in this or that way. Otherwise, the same thing happens. I mean, I'm not implying necessarily that these pieces of advice are entirely useless. But don't you think that they tend to be a little bit exaggerated, and sometimes some of these people might be preying on our insecurities or inventing new insecurities just to sell their, I don't know, training programs or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I do like you. I think that some of that information is really helpful to people, but it's always so fascinating to me how much is out there that people just like gravitate towards those messages. And I think that is in part because they are insecure, unnecessarily insecure about the influence that they have, that we really feel like, oh, I don't matter. People don't listen to me because we don't always see it. And so we feel like, oh, maybe if I take this course or read this book, I'll suddenly have this influence. And I think that those, sorts of resources are often geared to a very narrow form of influence, just like this very specific formal, I'm trying to convince a person who totally disagrees with me in this very formal context of something. Whereas the kind of influence I think about that's much more sort of common, right, is everyday influence when we just talk to people like humans, like face to face, talking to other people. That's really how minds change. Usually minds change and, people are change their behavior or learn new things and try new things in this more informal way. And so that's really where you have the most impact. But we don't think of that as impact. And I think that's really what I want people to start to do, is to think of all the small ways they impact people, which actually are the real ways that influence happens.
Yeah, and perhaps, I mean, just one last comment. Perhaps one of the things that these people get wrong is that they sort of make people think that other people are 100% of the time paying attention to every single detail and they remember every single word they say, and so they sort of become, I guess, extremely anxious about how they should prepare their speech and all of that. And as you said, and according to the research you present in the book, that's not true at all, right?
I think there's this idea that audiences and other people are like primed to like catch you saying something wrong, or like primed to argue against you or like disagree, but like people actually want to like you, like they, for the most part, again, and except in these very narrow situations, people want to
No.
connect with other people, they want you to do a good job, they actually want to agree with you. And so I think that's more common, as opposed to this other way of thinking about it, that everyone's waiting for you to say something wrong that they can jump on.
Right. So the book is, again, you have more influence than you think, how we underestimate our power of persuasion and why it matters. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview. Dr. Bohns, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. So you can go to my website, which is Vanessa Bohns, and Bonds is BOHNS.com. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Prof Bonds.
Great. I'm also leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, guys. Thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Perurga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Denbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, the RPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.